If you're watching this, then it means May the 9th passed, in terms of the Ukrainian crisis, relatively uneventfully. It means there was no declaration of war or call for mobilization by Vladimir Putin at the Victory Day celebration. It means there was no destruction of the Crimean Bridge, no great offensive, no great swings on the front. But one thing that did happen on May the 9th was that President Joe Biden signed into law the Lend-lease Act, or at least its modern incarnation intended to help Ukraine, the Ukraine Democracy Defense Lend-lease Act of 2020, if I've got that right. And this certainly is a development that has got the internet abuzz, and that's why I wanted to talk about it a little bit today. I'm going to do this in a relatively short form. This is not going to be a 50-minute video. This is me trialling a shorter form that's perhaps a bit more kind to me in the post-COVID sense. Now, contrary to the dreams and imaginations of lawyers everywhere, it's actually not quite often that a piece of legislation captures international attention. The Lend-lease Act, which is, again, the Ukraine Democracy Defense Lend-lease Act of 2020, is one act which has captured the popular imagination and the attention of the media. It sailed through the US Senate. It was passed in the House something like 420 to 10. I can't remember the exact numbers. And then on May 9th, at the White House, President Biden signed it into law because apparently the White House is now in the business of doing Reddit-level memes and decided to pass the modern incarnation of the Lend-lease Act, which has its genesis in World War II, passing that on the day in which Russia and many other post-Soviet states commemorate their victory over Nazi Germany. Now, the act is obviously hugely symbolic, and large swaths of the media and the internet alike have heralded it as the great breakthrough, that this is the thing that is going to get Ukraine the equipment they need to carry on the fight. The language that's often used is, if President Biden says it should go, it's on a plane and it's being shipped, that this is going to get Ukraine everything it needs to carry on this fight, which is why I thought it was worth a video. So what am I going to be covering? If this is going live after May 9th, and I assume it has, it means the act has passed into law and I can actually use this video, which is fantastic. So what I'll do is I'll give you a brief history of Lend-lease, its World War II incarnation and the modern one. I'm going to look at what the 2022 Act does, because I've read it. I'm going to ask the question of does it matter? And then I'm going to examine the associated myth that is being pushed in some Russian media that this is a giant debt trap for Ukraine. And then I'm going to try and finish this video up in record time. This will not be a 50-minute video. I'm struggling doing the 50-minute videos post-COVID, so I thought shorter ones on bite-sized topics, probably for the better. So let's talk about historical Lend-lease, because historical Lend-lease was an absolute game changer. I imagine a lot of the people watching this channel are already aware of this. But during World War II, the original Lend-lease Act, the United States passed laws that essentially got around its neutrality restrictions and allowed it to provide Britain, the British Empire, and the other co-belligerent countries, notably including the Soviet Union, with tremendous amounts of material on a credit basis. Hundreds of thousands of trucks, huge supplies of industrial material, weapons, guns, planes, strategic metals, fuel, all the necessary inputs for industry and for war went on a credit basis under the Lend-lease Act. It was at a point, I believe, something like 20% of US war spending was actually being spent sustaining the Allied powers. And it's important to note that it was extremely significant at the time to holding up the embattled economies of Britain and the Soviet Union during the darkest days of the war. It's particularly bitter in the context of passing it on May 9th, because the late Soviet and post-Soviet historiography has often tried to mitigate the importance of Lend-lease to sustaining the Soviet war effort during the Second World War. I'm not going to try and delve too deeply into the debate. It's enough for me that the numbers are immense and that even figures such as Georgy Zhukov came out and said that Lend-lease was spectacularly important in enabling both the economy of the Soviet Union to keep going and also to provide the mobility to the Red Army that it needed in order to make the best of its offensives late in the war. American trucks, American gasoline, American aviation fuel, American aluminium, American spam, all of this was immensely important. So as a result, Lend-lease is a sensitive issue in Russia for that reason, because some find it contrary to the narrative that the Soviet Union essentially won the war by itself. The Soviets certainly sacrificed an awful lot of blood and effort, and victory against Germany without the Soviet Union is difficult to conceive. But at the same time, Lend-lease did play a critical economic role in that war. So the question is, what does the modern act do? Or rather, what doesn't it do? because there is, frankly, an awful lot of hype around this particular act, as if it's going to suddenly unleash the military-industrial capacity of the West in order to drive the Russians across the border once again and give Ukraine a victory. So let's start by addressing some of the things that this act doesn't do. It doesn't mean that Ukraine gets everything that it wants. It doesn't mean that 2 weeks from now they're going to be training on F-35s in Poland before flying them across the border. It doesn't mean that Ukraine is going to bristle with Patriot missile batteries. It doesn't mean, contrary to some Russian propaganda, that nuclear weapons are going to go across the border. That's admittedly quite niche Russian propaganda, but I've seen it in a couple of places that Ukraine would get nukes through these assistance packages. It also doesn't just replace the existing aid package system. It doesn't really supplant them at all. It also doesn't give Ukraine an unlimited budget. This is still on a debt and lease basis, and Ukraine doesn't really have the financial carrying capacity that the Soviet Union or the United Kingdom did during the Second World War in relative terms. It's not a bill, in other words, that's going to win the war in an afternoon. So a good first stop, I think, is actually reading the Act. Not always easy if it's the US Tax Code or the Australian Corporations Act. The latter, I think, comes in at a cool 4,000 plus pages for anyone that's interested. But in this case, it's a page of text that basically comes down to two things. Two small waivers of restrictions that currently apply to the president's ability to lease defence articles to foreign powers, and a requirement that the president, within 60 days, basically come up with a plan for expediting delivery of defence articles that are loaned. So basically making it a little bit easier and telling the president to hurry up with anything that happens to be leased. I am going to look at both those individual changes now. So the change to Section 503b3 of the Foreign Assistance Act and Section 61 of the Arms Export Control Act. So the first change is really, really simple. It goes into the Act and it basically removes a requirement that at the moment says loan periods must be of a fixed duration, they cannot exceed 5 years, during which any article might be recalled for any reason by the US. So basically, it lifts the restriction that says you can't loan stuff for more than 5 years, and within the loan period, the US can ask for it back at any point. Now, that's important, but it's not exactly earth-shattering because there's still a range of restrictions and rules in place. The second set of restrictions includes a couple of items that are being bypassed. So the restriction against loaning anything that the military in the US might need. So the president has the ability to loan stuff even if the military might need it. President doesn't have to worry about whether this is going to cut into sales for the US military-industrial complex. There's changes to the way payments for depreciation and replacement are required. Now, obviously, if you're loaning stuff like ammunition, it's probably likely that you're not going to get it back in the condition you sent it. So things like payment for depreciation, replacement, those are important, as are the removal of the time limits. But these are the basics here. It's making it a little bit easier and it's taking some of the edge off. By its default, Lend-lease is a strict Lend-lease scheme. You loan someone stuff, but there's a genuine expectation that you get it back or it's paid for. This eases up those conditions a little bit. We can get more deep into the specifics, but I think that I can only talk about legislation for about 2 or 3 minutes straight before I lose about 50% of the audience. So let's instead move on to the critical question, because like I said, that's the bulk of the act right there. So the question is, does it matter? At least right now. And my answer, potentially a controversial answer, is with an asterisk, not really. The original Lend-lease Act, World War II, was a huge deal because at the time when it went into place, the US was bound by neutrality acts, rules which prevented the US from being even tangentially involved in the war in Europe. It was able to sell defence articles to Britain and Allied powers, but only on a cash and carry basis. Basically, you had to pay hard currency, and in a war, you run out of hard currency extremely quickly. So Lend-lease was significant because it unlocked the ability of America to provide war material to Britain and the Soviet Union at a time when neither of them were really long on gold and hard currency. They could provide it on a credit basis. And before Lend-lease, the Americans' ability to do that was very tightly hamstrung by law. And I'm not necessarily saying that Lend-lease is a bad deal, not at all. In fact, it's yet more proof that nations can get away with stuff that individuals can only dream of a lot of the time economically. If you rocked up to a service station and said, "Hey mate, can I borrow some petrol?" I think they'd look at you kind of funny. If you then said, "Hey, can I also borrow your ute? I'm going to use it to drive some mates of mine up to the front where we're going to fight Russians for a couple of months, and I promise I'll bring your truck back just fine. Trust me, it'll be great." I think you get all kinds of strange looks, but that's basically the Lend-lease arrangement. America being willing to provide large amounts of defense material on the promise that it's probably going to be returned one day or its value is eventually going to be paid off. And even those restrictions are being loosened under these changes. The reason it's not so significant is because of the way existing aid is being provided and how that's actually even more generous than, borrowing petrol and ammo, take you into a war zone and promising that, you'll be able to give it back one day. So if you look at how the US has been providing assistance to date, it's using mechanisms that don't really rely on Pavel and the TDF having to buff out the paint job of every vehicle that's sent to them. Otherwise, they lose their bond when they return it 4 years down the track. It's based on gifts, security assistance. One of the key mechanisms of delivering the more than $3 billion in aid that the United States has provided since the February offensives began is something called the Presidential Drawdown Authority. So this is basically a way to get around a lot of the bureaucracy and approvals process that is involved in arms exports and military assistance to the United States. The rule is pretty simple. The president identifies a threat to US national security, a pressing threat to a US ally or a point of US interest overseas, and says, this is so important, this poses such imminent danger that I have to provide military assistance now, and I'm going to bypass the regular approval chain in order to do that. Now, that means you can send equipment really, really quickly. It's close to what people have been describing the Lend-lease Act as. It's a case where the president says it, and it's more or less on its way as fast as the US military's logistical systems can carry it, which is pretty damn fast, all things considered. The only limitation that they face in terms of using this authority is, for reasons of checks and balances, this authority is quite strictly limited in terms of dollar value. When the crisis started, it was locked at $100 million. That is, in a financial year, the president could authorize up to $100 million of military aid under this provision. It's been increased to $3 billion, and most of that has already been used in order to support Ukraine. It's possible even all of it has been used because we don't have the most recent figures. You can see the material there from the Congressional Research Service. It's now on its way to $8 billion. And that's as a part of the $30 billion ask that we'll look at in a moment. And there are other frameworks beyond just the presidential drawdown to cover things like training assistance, wherein the US military can provide training. It resumed doing that in April in order to help onboard the Ukrainians on various NATO systems. And there's other foreign aid measures that we'll have a look at in a moment as part of this broader $30 billion aid package. So really, the United States so far hasn't needed to go through, the legal fiction of having to lend bullets to someone in a war zone. That fiction's been unnecessary because it's been able to basically gift them and supply them to the Ukrainians. And now there's a request from the White House they do so on a far greater level. Because if you're looking for a game changer in terms of aid to Ukraine, I'd argue that the recent request from the White House for this $30 billion package is probably far more significant than the Lend-lease Act. It also illustrates the various measures and mechanisms that the US has available to it to provide aid. So inside that $30 billion, you've got the $5 billion extra into the Presidential Drawdown Authority. So this basically is a case of, we're not sure what equipment we're going to need to provide yet, but allow us to provide an extra $5 billion on short notice, basically on the president's authority. Give him permission to send up to $5 billion of extra equipment. Then there's $6 billion into the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, which is more certain, has more visibility over it, but is a little less responsive. And then there's $4 billion into foreign military financing. And this is similar to something that Germany's been doing. And foreign military financing is basically a case of, you don't ship weapons to Ukraine, or you don't nominate weapons and pass them to Ukraine. What you do is you give Ukraine $4 billion and you tell it to go shopping. Because no one knows what the Ukrainians need better than the Ukrainians. So the idea is you basically give them money and give them the credit card and tell them to go buy what they need. That's what foreign military financing is in a nutshell. Then there's $8.5 billion in economic assistance. This is civil economic assistance. This is to try and keep the Ukrainian government going. Because during a war, a couple of things happen when your country is invaded. The first thing is that tax receipts tend to go way down, understandably. And the second thing is expenses tend to go way up. Now, the Ukrainian budget in peacetime is relatively small, but during wartime you can expect that to explode at the same time that revenues dive. So this and other donor elements are critical to keeping the Ukrainian government's wheels turning. This is the economic umbilical cord that's going to keep Kyiv moving. And of course, there's $3 billion in humanitarian assistance in. This is to provide food, shelter, and support to dislocated people within Ukraine, and support some of the basic humanitarian needs, which is helpful because it also takes a burden off either the Ukrainian government or the governments that are hosting those refugees and those personnel in the first place. So if you reflect on where we were in February, $30 billion is a huge escalation. We're at, going into this request, we were at 3, now we're going to 30. This is pretty natural growth, close to what I would have predicted, close to what I did predict in that very first video, All Bleed No Basics, at the absolute start of this conflict. It's probably a little bit slower than the Ukrainians would like in terms of ramping up, but it certainly does show signs of ramping up. A serious increase in the amount of material that's going, and of course, a significant increase in the direct financial assistance that's going to let the Ukrainian government continue functioning, no matter how much the Russian government batters its infrastructure or tries to disrupt its operation. It's an effective combination of equipment funding, operational funding, economic and humanitarian support. The full gamut of assistance that goes well beyond just leasing particular military hardware. Now, given the stated goals of the United States, and this is worth dwelling on for a moment, the stated goals of the United States and its allies are to enable Ukraine to win this conflict. That is, to achieve an advantageous settlement on the field of battle so that the Russians, they don't have to concede additional territory to the Russians, and also to degrade the Russian military so that it's unlikely to be able or tempted to try something like this again, either against Ukraine or against Finland or the Baltic countries or some other nation on its periphery. Given those goals, $30 billion is probably still short. I would suggest it's probably still short of zero. I think if you're looking at the sort of resources that are going to be needed to sustain Ukraine and inflict a decisive military defeat on the Russian Federation, you need to start thinking that this war is going to cost about as much as the Afghan or Iraq conflicts, albeit over a much shorter time period, but at a much higher level of intensity. So you need to be thinking probably in hundreds of billions of dollars as opposed to 30 billion. But 30 billion is still a very significant injection. It's almost as large as the ordinary Ukrainian government budget. And we're quickly approaching the point where we will have spent more in aid to Ukraine than the Russians would spend on defense in an average year. So it's certainly a major escalation. And the way this thing is structured gives me a good opportunity to address this debt trap myth. I was going to put this in a myth-busting video, but I figured it belonged better with this particular content. A lot of the coverage around German assistance to Ukraine and also around the Lend-lease Act that I've seen from Russian media, from TASS, and also on Telegram and a number of channels, has been that this is basically a glorified debt trap that's intended to turn Ukraine into a Western puppet. And the theory basically goes that Ukraine will indebt itself buying hardware, and as a result, the Western powers will own it. The confusion here comes from, I suppose, the nature of the Lend-lease Act and also the way the Germans have done a lot of their assistance. It's true, for example, that Ukrainians are buying a lot of the hardware that is going to be coming from Germany, but they've received funding from Germany in order to make those purchases. Similarly, the United States, through foreign military financing assistance, provides funds directly to Ukraine so that they can then use those funds to purchase military hardware. The Lend-lease Act itself hasn't really been activated, so we're not seeing equipment provided on a lease basis. Everything that's going so far is pretty much going on a grant basis. There is no sign of a debt trap. In fact, quite to the contrary, instead of loaning Ukraine very large amounts of money, what we've just talked about is the fact that in that $30 billion package, there is $8.5 billion of economic assistance to Ukraine, both to the government and also to things like keeping the agricultural sector running and things like that. That's not really the behavior that you'd be expecting if you were trying to trap this country into debt, basically. Instead, it's better to think of the Ukrainian economy as basically the end of a conveyor belt. Goods, money, and equipment shuffle down that conveyor belt from the United States. They cross the Atlantic. They enter Europe. There they pick up all the donations from Germany, from Britain, from Poland, from the Czechs, from Portugal, from Spain, from Italy, from all these countries that are involved in supporting the Ukrainian effort. And that money and equipment flows into Ukraine either digitally or through the railway links into Poland. And that is what is keeping the Ukrainian economy running, despite the immense pressure that it must be under. So the question then is, what happens next? We wait and see if the 30 billion gets passed, and if the 30 billion is passed, what work commences on the act that must inevitably follow it, what else gets passed in the UK, in Germany, in France, in the various European parliaments, what else do we see come out of NATO-aligned countries like Japan, the Republic of Korea, Australia, in terms of additional assistance. And we look for signs of ongoing transition towards NATO standard hardware. We've already now seen NATO howitzers transition to 155mm guns happening. We've seen the introduction of NATO precision munitions, NATO drones. We look out in the upcoming aid packages to see more evidence of that stage 4 transition that I discussed in a previous video. A sign that there is a willingness to fund the transition of Ukraine out of the Warsaw Pact era and into the NATO era, not just so that the conflict is sustainable, that is, we can provide ammunition and support for those weapon systems, but also so the Ukrainians can enjoy a technological or capability edge over their Russian opponents. Because if indeed the goal is, and we don't see wavering on the goal of assisting Ukraine in obtaining a military victory as opposed to just a really bloody extended stalemate, there probably has to be a transition towards a point where the Ukrainians enjoy technological superiority. And that's going to be an incredibly expensive process. We should also look for evidence that the Defence Production Act or its equivalent or industry plans across Europe and North America are activated. Because there's a real question of ramp up of production in the military industrial complexes of these states if they're going to be able to sustain this effort long term. If this war is relatively short, it's probably not a problem. Existing NATO stockpiles are extremely deep. The US is not running out of weapons. Lord, I want to deal with that myth. But the longer this goes, the more significant it is that we look for signs that industry is being pushed to ramp up production levels. The inflection point on spending balance isn't here yet, but it's approaching. I mean, the point where we get to a stage where Ukraine is being infused with more resources than Russia can expend. The point where the military assistance to Ukraine exceeds the capacity of Russia to spend on and sustain its military effort. And that's the stage at which the strength of the Ukrainian military can start to increase relative to its Russian opponent, and we can start thinking about things that aren't just small-scale local counteroffensives and slowing Russian advances and elements like that. So we've got to watch for that point. The 30 billion is going to get us closer to that point. Lend-lease is a tool, but I don't see any evidence yet that the Ukrainians aren't still, in economic terms at least, the strong underdogs. My personal view, and I want to move away from the numbers for a moment, just give a personal evaluation, is that the existing aid packages still have the hallmarks of emergency assistance designed to keep Ukraine afloat, to halt the Russian Donbass offensives, to stabilize the front. They have those sort of character rather than the character of war-winning measures. But that's also not unusual. There was a lot of criticism in the early stages of the Second World War that Lend-lease took a while to ramp up, that assistance from the United States to the Allies was a little bit slow and lethargic to arrive, that what arrived at first was inadequate to the task at hand, but it really did ramp up quite quickly and became war-winning, essentially, in later years. So this slow ramp-up, this focus on emergency measures rather than war-winning ones, that's nothing new. So let me circle back to the issue of Lend-lease then. Does it have a role? If what matters are these aid packages, the presidential drawdown, foreign military financing, and the equivalents in Europe and allied countries, does Lend-lease have a role? I think it does, in the sense that it is highly symbolic. And in terms of practical terms, Lend-lease is there as another tool the president can use as a backstop if, for example, at any point there's political deadlock in Congress. It's obviously much better for Ukraine if it gets hardware through the presidential drawdown, if it's assistance, if it's aid, if it's being given with no strings attached. But let's say, for example, the US Congress gets bogged down. Maybe Ukraine would be willing to accept equipment on a lease basis temporarily, hoping that more aid packages get passed down the line. And, they could get pretty creative with it. I think 99-year leases need to come back into vogue. That's a good way to do it. The alternative is you lend stuff to them, and then later on, further down the track, once Congress is back on board, you provide them financial aid to help pay off the debt, or you waive the debt later on. But the point is it gets equipment there in the meantime. So that's definitely a potential point of significance. We've got to see some 99-year leases to Ukraine. I mean, it is worth remembering that in the World War II context, only the tiniest fraction of US military aid sent under Lend-lease was ever repaid for. The Soviets and the Americans argued over the bill for civilian assistance for a long time, and all the military assistance was written off. Britain took ages to make its payments, but again, most of this stuff that was sent was never paid for. One has to imagine that in the context of the Ukraine conflict, something similar would emerge if indeed this authority is used on a larger scale. So that's something. I also think that signing it on May 9th was a tremendous meme that was worthy of a Reddit veteran, and we should call that out. This is a reminder to Russia and the Soviet Union that World War II very much was a joint effort, that it was Soviet blood, British endurance, and American bullets that won the war in Europe. We talk about the war as a whole, and you need to add Chinese blood and Indian blood to that consideration as well. But as far as Europe goes, certainly the Soviet Union made the most tremendous sacrifice in terms of lives lost in total in aggregate. Mind you, that definition of the Soviet Union included Ukraine at the time. But the role of the American economy can't be understated, and signing this act on May 9th certainly brings that point home. So in summary, Lend-lease really isn't a huge game changer because other preferable mechanisms are already in place. There are other ways to get assistance to Ukraine that aren't loaning them equipment. The act is, however, highly symbolic, provides another mechanism. It's a backstop if all things go wrong and the US runs out of authorization for presidential drawdown and they need to get something there in the meantime. But while Lend-lease itself isn't a game changer, foreign weapons are. The hardware that is going into Ukraine, and yes, it faces logistical difficulties getting from the west of the country to the front lines. Yes, there are going to be delays around training timetables and getting new units operational with this sort of equipment. But the truth is, foreign weapons have already had a decisive impact in the Ukrainian conflict. Shoulder-fired missiles made a difference during the opening phase. Howitzers, artillery, drones, precision-guided munitions, all of them are making a difference now and will continue to make a difference into the future. So that $30 billion request is extremely significant, and its passage would change things on the ground considerably, adding an order of magnitude to the existing aid that has already been provided. It's going to take some time for me, and this is my closing thought, to adjust to this shorter form content, but I hope this was useful. The Lend-lease Act is historical, it's significant, it's worth talking about, but it's not the complete game changer that everyone, or at least some people, are making it out to be. What is more important is that for those that are invested in aid continuing to go to Ukraine, that the focus remains on parliaments, that it remains on governments to continue securing and voting for these new aid packages that are going to sustain the Ukrainians going forward. Because Lend-lease hasn't solved that basic problem. It's going to need to be those governments voting through those funds, and it's going to need to be the logisticians translating those voted funds into equipment that actually arrives at the Ukrainian battlefronts. Thanks very much for your time, and I'll see you again soon. And just a brief post-recording addenda from me on 2 points. The first is I'd really like feedback on this shorter form content. Shorter is a relative term, I know. Compared to most videos on YouTube, this is a stretch, but it's not an hour long, and that's a change for me, and I'd like to know how people feel about this simpler topic covered quickly relative to the 50-minute video. The second thing is a final call for interesting examples of propaganda. I have accumulated some fantastic propaganda examples through my Perun submissions email from both sides of this conflict, and I would like to put out the final word for submissions in this area. So Redditors, NCD, guys, if you are listening, I want the best examples you have of propaganda or of copium that you have found on the internet or on TV. Russia drowning the British Isles with a single underwater hyper high yield hydrogen bomb, to all sorts of coke cages and the best stuff of Reddit. Please send it to me. I'll go through it. I'll synthesize it. And if I've got enough to make a video in the next week or two, I'll try and bring a little bit of levity to this conflict by examining some of the most extreme propaganda and myths that have grown out of it, and obviously, if necessary, taking a little bit of time to debunk them. I just think it'd be an interesting and entertaining exercise, and that matters. So, once again, thank you for joining me today. Thank you for your patience during this post-COVID period, and I look forward to seeing what you submit. Cheers.